The title of your PhD thesis was A Defense of Robust Meta-Normative Realism. So if you could break that down for us piece by piece, what is robust about this? What does meta-normative mean? And why is this a realism? What is this meta-ethical view?
Okay, so let's start with the meta-normative stuff. So I think of the moral or ethical or both as a particular instance of the normative. So that there's more to the normative than just the moral properties, moral facts. They are paradigmatic normative facts and properties, but there are also others, perhaps some epistemic facts, perhaps some prudential facts, perhaps there are others as well. So the normative is just a superset of the ethical, and because realism, which I'll get to in a second, is an existentially quantified thesis, right? This is about there being such properties and facts, then a meta-normative realism is strictly weaker than a meta-ethical one. So strictly speaking, I'm only insisting on there being some normative facts and properties remaining officially neutral on whether any of them are also moral. You can believe that there are normative facts, but that actually the subset of them, which constitutes the moral fact, is actually an empty subset. So that's why it's meta-normative. As it happens, I also think that once you're willing to go realist on the normative, refusing to go realist on the ethical becomes just undermotivated. So I think it supports the more narrowly meta-ethical realism, but it doesn't entail it, it supports it. So much for the meta-normative part of that. What is now apparent, clearly not the most attractive of titles. Realism is roughly the view, realism say about, but for now let's talk as if we're doing meta-ethics and not meta-normativity. We can go back to meta-normativity later on. So meta-ethical realism is roughly the view that there are moral facts, that there are moral properties, that when we are, that our moral discourse, at least when successful, captures them. It's about these moral facts and properties. So you are one way of rejecting realism is to deny that moral discourse is even in the business of describing the moral parts of the universe. And it's not about capturing fact, it's about voicing emotions, say, or something along these lines. So that's one way of rejecting realism. You are a realist if you think that moral discourse is very much in the business of being true or false, stating facts and so on. Another way, paradigmatic way of rejecting realism is to think that even though the discourse is in the business of achieving truth, it never succeeds in doing that. So that's the kind of view that many of us have, say, about astrology. We don't think that astrological discourse is merely about emoting. We think it's about stating some factual claims, except they are all systematically false, or anyway, none of them is true. There is some error that is just runs through the entire astrological discourse. So one can have a similar view about morality. You may think, sure, it attempts to describe the moral parts of the universe, but there are no such parts to the universe.
Yes.
Moral discourse is ridden with systematic
Right.
error.
So this is Matt Lutz and others' moral error theory.
Right. So I think the name who's most commonly associated with a moral error theory is J.L. Mackie, but there are many others who have followed suit in different ways, obviously. Right. So the most minimal kind of realism is just the denial of these two ways of rejecting it. Namely, moral claims are in the business of being true or false. They are factual claims. They are at least attempts at describing the moral parts of the universe. And second, at least sometimes they succeed. So it's not as if they are ridden with systematic error. But that's probably not enough. Another thing that people often associate with realism, as do I, is the thought that there, at least in a sense, moral facts are objective. Now this in a sense bit is important because there are different ways of thinking about this, but let's go again in the opposite direction. Suppose you think that all it takes for an action to be wrong is for it to be such that the powerful hate it. Well, if that's your view, then in an at least intuitive sense, you're not a realist. It's not as if you're not an error theorist, because the powerful certainly hate a few things, right? And the discourse may still be fact stating or descriptive or something along these lines, but it is way too strongly dependent on us and our responses. In the case of the toy example that I gave, the responses of some of us, right? The powerful. So in order to be a realist, it seems like you have to believe that moral facts, moral properties are, at least to an extent, response independent, perspective independent. They don't depend on our will. They are such that when we are successful in our moral inquiries, we discover rather than create or construct or legislate or anything along these lines. So these are the three tenets of what at least I would call realism. But again, everything is controversial, including how we use the term. It has to be fact stating. Error theory has to be rejected, and it can't be too subjective. Some moral realists, many moral realists, are metaphysical naturalists. So they think roughly that the ultimate list of the things that exist comes from the natural sciences. The only thing, I mean, not today's natural sciences, because there's still some work to be done, but that's pretty much it. Or the kind of things that exist are the kind of things that the natural sciences study. And that's it, crucially, and that's it. If that's what you think, but you also want to be a realist, so you don't want to, as it were, throw moral facts out of your ontology. What you need to do is to give an account of moral facts as themselves being, at the end of the day, a natural fact. And some people do that, and some people do that while satisfying the sort of three conditions that I started with. So they can be called naturalist realists. When I say that I'm a robust realist, really what I mean is mostly that I'm not a naturalist. So I believe that the moral part of the universe, as it were, is radically different from the natural parts of the universe. Moral facts are of a different kind than the kind of facts that we study in our successful natural sciences.
What are some examples of moral realist naturalism? Some views, like what would they say moral properties are? What would they say moral reality is that would be amenable to scientific investigation?
Right. So obviously different realists will have different views, right? But a toy example that's often given is at least a version of utilitarianism. So you may think that for an action to be right, just is for it to be such that there's no alternative with better consequences in terms of utility, right? Be it pleasure over pain or happiness over suffering or something along these lines. If you think not just that actions are permissible if and only if they maximize utility, but that's what it is for an action to be permissible. It's for it to be such that it maximizes utility. If you go for this identity claim, notice that on one side you have a normative and a moral claim, what it is for an action to be morally permissible, right? But on the other side, what you have is a natural property. Maximizing utility is, well, hard to study, not impossible to study naturalistically, right? It's pretty much a complicated psychological fact, but a psychological fact nonetheless. So that would be a naturalist, realist view. There could be others, as long as you go for this kind of an identity claim.
So that's interesting to me. I've always wondered about the relationship between these normative theories like utilitarianism and metaethics. And so what you're saying, I take it, is that you don't have to be a utilitarian and a moral naturalist, but you can be if you think that central claim that the right thing to do is that action that maximizes, say, a simplistic version like pleasure over pain. If you think that's an identity claim, that for something to be morally obligatory just is for it to maximize pleasure over pain, then you're a moral naturalist. But you don't have to be. You could still be a utilitarian in that simple form and say this is a fundamental normative claim that the right thing to do is to maximize pleasure over pain. But now I'm a bit confused. How would you avoid the identity? What would it be to be a utilitarian without that identity?
Well, you would have to say something. You would still want there to be a very close connection between the property of being morally permissible and the property of being utility maximizing. But you would want to avoid the identity claim. so you would have to rely on some other kind of relation. Here's one possibility. You may think, for instance, that the natural property grounds the normative one. But we know that grounding is not identity. It actually does capture an intuitive feature, right? So grounding is anti-symmetric in a way that identity is not. Identity is obviously symmetrical, right? So you may want to say, look, some actions are permissible in virtue of being utility maximizing. But I don't think it's true that some actions are utility maximizing in virtue of being permissible. So there's some strong intuitive pressure not to go for an identity claim, or at least not to go for only an identity claim, to go for a more complicated view that incorporates something by way of asymmetry. It's actually, things get quite complicated here because often naturalism, or at least some versions of naturalism, are put in terms of a reduction, reducing the normative to the natural, say. But reduction, and this is a point that's often made, reduction is also anti-symmetrical. On the other hand, reduction seems to involve an identity claim. So something weird's going on, right? But there are things we can say. Perhaps reduction is identity plus something else that takes care of the asymmetrical feature. There are now some people who think that naturalism can be put in terms of grounding. So that if you're going to be a non-naturalist, you have to reject the grounding claim too, or anyway, some grounding claims. You may think, for instance, that the fact that an action is permissible is partly grounded in the fact that it maximizes utility, but also partly and indispensably grounded in something else, like perhaps a moral principle. As long as you think that there is something that's ineliminably moral or normative in the analysans, in the thing doing the analyzing, or in the grounds, or in the thing to which you reduce stuff, then you count as a non-naturalist. But as I said, everything in this neighborhood is controversial, including how to characterize the very naturalism that we sometimes argue
Yeah, well, I figured that out from talking to Matt Lutz, because Eric Wielenberg explained the distinction between naturalism and non-naturalism to me as the distinction between descriptive versus evaluative facts. So a descriptive fact is just the way the world, something stating the way the world is. An evaluative fact is stating something about the way the world ought to be. So on the face of it, I get what that means. And so then the moral naturalist is saying that ultimately moral claims are descriptive. They are facts about the way the world is, facts about what maximizes utility, what maximizes the flourishing of conscious creatures, as Sam Harris might say. That's like a pretty recognizable, just descriptive scientific claim. But then the moral non-naturalist says, no. Moral facts ultimately are evaluative. They're fundamentally evaluative, or at least in part evaluative. They are irreducible claims about the way the world ought to be that you can't break down any further into a descriptive claim. So I can at least understand all that. If that makes sense to me, that clicks things into place. Now, Matt Lutz vigorously disagreed with the intelligibility of that distinction. But for you, do you think that's a fair way of characterizing the naturalism, non-naturalism as fundamental descriptive versus fundamental evaluative or normative?
Okay, so I'm going to be annoyingly analytic and do what the character of the analytic philosopher always does, namely introduce distinctions. So one important distinction here is between what is sometimes called metaphysical naturalism and sometimes moral or ethical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism is a view in general metaphysics. It's not in any way peculiar to the moral or even to the normative. It is roughly the claim that the only facts that there are natural facts. Or perhaps sometimes the only things that exist are the kind of things studied by the natural sciences. That's not a view specifically about ethics, but of course a view about ethics does follow, right? What follows is if there are moral facts, then they just are natural facts. You are a moral or ethical naturalist if you think that moral facts just are natural facts. The distinction is important because there are ways of being a metaphysical naturalist without being a moral naturalist. Here's a clear example. You can go aerotheoretic, right? If you go aerotheoretic on morality, you may still be, for anything we've just said anyway, you may still be a metaphysical naturalist. You may still think that when it comes to the ultimate list of the parts of the universe, it's all put in natural terms. But you are not a moral naturalist. You don't think that moral facts just are natural facts. In fact, you think that there are no moral facts, right? So we do want to distinguish between metaphysical naturalism and moral naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism is not best thought of in terms of the distinction between the descriptive and the evaluative. Moral naturalism or ethical naturalism is naturally thought of in this way. So again, it's not as if the view, moral naturalism, just is the distinction, but a good way of explaining what the controversy over moral naturalism is in terms of the controversy about the relations between descriptive and evaluative claims.
Okay, so basically you agree with that way of drawing the distinction between ethical naturalism and non-naturalism. Is that fair enough?
To a close approximation.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, this will come up in the debate between Matt and Mike, but Matt's concerns, as far as I understood them, were that what counts as an evaluative claim, I think this is what he said, is that what counts as an evaluative claim is largely language relative, and I would assume the same for a descriptive claim, and so it's going to be difficult to draw a hard and fast distinction between the two. I mean, on the face of it, I know what the distinction is, but if that's right, if it's just a matter of convention, what counts as descriptive and what counts as evaluative, well, then we might not want to draw the distinction between these two obviously separate views as a matter of convention. I don't know if you have any.
That's the kind of problem that I had in mind when I said to a close approximation. I don't think anything here is language dependent.
Right.
We're doing metaphysics here. Why on earth would anything be language dependent? I think that here's a better way of looking at it. I think. Okay. Think of some descriptive claims, paradigmatic descriptive claims, not as it were de dicto, not under this description. Just give me the examples. Okay. The sun burns at this and those temperatures. Typically, when people are subject to great pressure, they feel pain. I don't know, feeling whatever you want, right? Okay. Now give me a list of some paradigmatic evaluative claims. Again, I don't care about the description as evaluative. Just give me the examples themselves. It's wrong to humiliate people. It's not a good idea to form beliefs by wishful thinking. Your future pain matters. I don't know. And some other stuff if you want. Then what I want to say is to use these examples as just examples for what are kinds of propositions or kinds of facts. Just think about the facts, the kind of facts of which the first set of examples are good paradigmatic examples. I don't care what you call them, and I certainly don't care what linguistic structures you use in order to capture them. Similarly, think about the kind of facts that for which the second group was a group of paradigmatic examples, whatever you call them. I insist these are radically two kinds of claims. And in particular, there are no true identity statements with going across this divide. This way of putting things has nothing to do with language. I mean, I put it in language, but it's not about language. And it rigidly captures whatever it captures. It doesn't depend on differences in linguistic usage. So yeah, for me, the distinction is not about language at all. I do think that thinking in terms of roughly the is-ought distinction, the fact-value distinction, or whatever, these are good ladders, as it were.
Yeah.
Right? They can get us close to what we want, but they're not an essential part of what we're doing.
Okay, I think that's a fair response. So my concern primarily is not with the distinction between like cognitivists and non-cognitivists, the question of like, what do people intend to do with their moral language? Do they intend to express facts, moral facts, or do they intend to do something else? Are they just expressing emotion, for example? Rather, I want to ask about why we shouldn't be moral error theorists. For me, for whatever that's worth, the most plausible views on the table would be moral error theory or a robust moral realism. So what reasons motivate you in affirming robust moral realism over just saying, yeah, these are the intentions of our moral language, but all of our moral claims are just false? Why would you not agree with that?
Yeah, so let's definitely get into this, but can I first say something about, as it were, the methodology here, okay? Because you express the kind of sympathies of a philosophical extremist. I'm going to be well, I think I'm going to be rephrasing you. If not, please correct me. Right? You're saying something like, look, I know what I want when I do ethics. What I want is the whole thing. These moral facts, they don't depend on us in any way, fully objective, necessary, whatever. I don't know, maybe you even want them to be causally efficacious, something along these lines. And if I don't get that, then error theory. If I do get that, if the universe cooperates, then robust realism, right? But these are the only two options. The job description of moral facts, that job description is set, and either the universe satisfies it or it does not, which is another way of saying either robust moral realism or error theory. Fair enough? Does this capture your kind of intuition here? Okay. I used to think this way too. I even said in the book that I think it's a very interesting question to ask philosophers what your second best view is. So if God whispered in your ear that your view is false, what would be your second best view in the area, right? And I said, well, for me, my view is robust moral realism. But if God whispered in my ear that robust realism is false, I'd go error theory for something like this line of thought. I'm not sure that's right anymore. Partly the thought experiment of, if God whispered in your ear, etc., is always dangerous. But as one of my teachers told me back then, when I ran this thought experiment on him, it was artery filled. He thought for a while and he said, I don't know, I think I'd ask God why my view is false. And it makes sense to think that, which view you would go for as the second best may depend on that, right? But another is a quote I love bringing from David Lewis. I think it's in his paper in Metaethics on dispositional theories of value. And he asks, it's in a context that's it's methodologically similar to the one that we are discussing now. And he talks about how we found out that there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity from Einstein, right? And it says something like, it's not the exact quote, shout it from the rooftops. No such thing as absolute simultaneity. No one whistled while they worked. And that seems like a very powerful reductio, right? But notice that your intuition here, my past self intuition here, is precisely the one being ridiculed. Because you could say, look, when it comes to simultaneity, I know what I want. I want absolute simultaneity. You can talk about simultaneity, I don't know, relative to a frame of reference until the cows come home, but I know what I want. I want the absolute thing. And either the universe cooperates or it doesn't. If it does, all is well. If not, I'll go error theoretic, which means that no one ever whistled while they worked. Right? Whereas Lewis is being much more tolerant, as it were. Says, no. Actually, error theory is not a real option here. Of course, people whistle while they work. And if that means that you should revise your job description, now that you know that nothing can do the job of absolute simultaneity, that doesn't mean you need to conclude that no one ever whistled while they work. What you need to conclude is that you never actually cared about absolute simultaneity. You were fine with other things as well, things that are consistent with our best physics. And that's good enough. So that was a very long and sort of roundabout way of saying, I'm not sure that the spirit of philosophical extremism is always the way to go. But I still see its appeal, and I'm happy to talk about why we should go robust realist rather than error theoretic. And I definitely have a lot of respect for error theoretical views, at least compared to some of the intermediate views that often seem to me like cheating. Like a way of trying to convince you that you've never wanted more to begin with, which is just false.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a fair corrective that I'll have to think about. I don't know that I have any profound thoughts off the top of my head. I guess just to make a purely descriptive claim about me, an autobiographical claim, is that I feel the threat of moral error theory. I feel its plausibility because it does align so much with convictions I already have. It's just like one step away. We get rid of the claim that our moral claims are true. So it's in that sense, it's very close to the views I already hold. Rather than, so there's a sense in which they're not really like the two extremes. Rather, they overlap considerably, but of course they differ on one claim, which then has huge implications either way.
It's true though. It's true that they overlap. Error theory is often presented as the conjunction of two kinds of claim. One is a claim about the commitments of the relevant discourse, and the second is the claim about the universe, and in particular showing that the commitments from the first claim are not actually met in the way the world is. And it's an often made point that error theorists and robust moral realists tend to agree on the first part of the error theory. That's not just true in ethics, it's true elsewhere as well, right? So if you're a Platonist about abstract objects, you believe that numbers and sets and whatever are abstract and necessary and purely objective and whatever. If you are an error theorist about abstract objects, you agree about the job description. You agree that that's what would have to be the case for abstract objects to exist. But then you say that the universe is such that there are no such things, right? So you're right that there is a lot of agreement, at least at the level of characterizing our commitments, between the moral error theorist and the robust realist. But then, of course, they end up with strongly opposed views on the, resultant claims. Yeah. So why should we go for, with that contrast now? So we're now putting to one side all of these wishy-washy intermediate positions or whatever, right? And we're now thinking about the real strong candidates, robust realism on one side, error theory on the other. Why should we go for robust realism? Okay. So here's one kind of consideration here. I think you will find it close to impossible to avoid making moral judgments, or to avoid those parts of social practice that seem to presuppose moral judgments. Just try not to resent someone who wrongs you, ever. Not to blame anyone, to educate your kids without referring to without using moral language, and so on. Now, there is an easy retort for the error theorist, so I want to preempt it. The easy retort is to say, yeah, but I can explain why you would do these things without invoking moral facts. Something about, the evolutionary benefits of speaking this way. I actually don't think that works, but maybe something along these lines could work. So I want to note that my point here is not explanatory, and it's not third personal. It's crucial that it's run in the first person. Okay, so my question is not, look at these people who moralize. Can you explain their moralizing without invoking moral facts? I'm willing to give social science and psychology carte blanche that they will succeed in doing so. I don't know that they have already, but I don't care. That's fine. My question is to you in the first person. Don't try to explain why it is that you moralize, even if there are no moral facts. Can you go on without moralizing? Can you, in good faith, be a moral error theorist? Now, I don't think of this as a conclusive argument, obviously, but I do think that this should give you pause, right? When Hartree Field puts forward an error theory about numbers, he doesn't just give an argument and stop there. He also shows, or attempts to show, I think the jury's still out on that you can do science without numbers, right? That's the name of his book. Namely, that you can in good faith continue to rely on these things without the ontological commitment. Okay, next time someone cuts you off on the road and you resent them, next time you want to punish someone, next time you want to praise someone, next time you feel really proud of something that you've done with a moral aspect to it, next time you feel guilty, fill in all of these details. Tell me how you make all of these things respectable, as it were, without any moral facts. You could just decide that they're not respectable. You could say, that's all, that's like feeling angry at the table when I bump my knee against the table's leg, right? Yeah, I feel angry at the table, but I know it's bullshit. I don't, as it were, reflectively stand behind my feeling of anger towards the table, because I know it's just an inanimate object. Can you, in good faith, think precisely along these lines about all of your moral emotions, all of your participation in social moral practices, and so on? Now, I'm not even saying that you can't. What I am saying is that's not going to be easy. It's a huge price to pay. So at the very least, the burden of proof is on the error theorist. And now we need to, look through the arguments and see how convincing are the moral error theorists' positive arguments for their error theory, or the negative arguments against realism, and so on. I think it's going to be a kind of a general, holistic evaluation of plausibility of different ways to go. But I really think that, as with every theory, you should start with a clear and honest appreciation of just how intuitive or counterintuitive it is. Seriously going error theoretic on morality is unbelievably counterintuitive. The arguments would have to be shockingly strong to justify anything like this. And to get back to the point we started with, if you now think that furthermore we should go error theoretic on the normative, not just on the moral, then things are going to be harder still. So now you're going to have to say something about why it's not a good idea to form beliefs in wishful thinking, why it's much better to form them by inference to the best explanation, say. You're going to have to do this without invoking any normative language or anything like a normative fact. You would have to support your own error theory without talking of supporting, because supporting seems like a normative relation. Again, I'm not seriously arguing the self-defeat point here. It would need more details. What I am saying is the costs are unbelievably high. If you want to go down that route, you need arguments that are, so much stronger than the ones we've been given so far by error theorists.
Is this just a pragmatic argument for robust moral realism? By which I mean, is this argument really just saying that if we reject the contention that our moral claims are true, if we reject that, life becomes really hard to live consistently. And so in that sense, there's a huge cost. We constantly rely upon moral language and claims to navigate life, and maybe it's even psychologically impossible to avoid doing so. And so you're caught in a deep inconsistency in the way you conduct your life. I mean, those just strike me as pragmatic considerations that have no necessary or even likely connection to the truth. They just seem orthogonal to concerns that might latch on to what's true. These are just saying life gets hard. Maybe I'm wrong there, but is this a more pragmatic argument?
No, it's a natural word to have, but that's not how I think of it. Here's the way of thinking about it that is perhaps a little bit less amenable to this way of understanding it. God rarely whispers things in our ear, right? So we're down here with all sorts of evidence, things that we believe, things that seem more and less plausible to us, and we're just trying to do our best. What this means, among other things, is that whenever a theory leads to a counterintuitive results, it loses some points. That doesn't mean that whenever a theory leads to a counterintuitive implication, it means that it's false or refuted, because it may still earn points elsewhere. Maybe it succeeds in explaining a lot of stuff. Maybe it's a beautiful theory. Maybe it's ontologically parsimonious, right? There are lists of theoretical virtues. Those lists too, of course, are controversial because everything interesting is, but yeah, something along these lines. What I highlighted or tried to highlight earlier is precisely the thought that going error theoretic leads to tremendously counterintuitive implications. The counterintuitive implications are not how hard it is for you to stop blaming people. The counterintuitive implication is that it's always wrong to blame people. Or, I don't know about wrong, because it's always a mistake. Or anyway, any statement of the form, someone's blameworthy for something, is false, or anyway not true. And similarly for the thought that it's wrong to humiliate people, and similarly for all of these are highly, the way I picture it is that all of these intuitive propositions, they come with price tags. The price is, and the currency is plausibility points. Well, other things being equal, if you have two theories, one entails that it is wrong to humiliate people, and one entails that that sentence is false or perhaps just not true. Well, that's a few plausibility points for the former kind of view. It's not conclusive. We're going to go for a kind of holistic evaluation of theories, of competing theories, but it's definitely a price tag. And similarly for many, many other things. And if you go metanormative, then you get an even wider set of propositions with rather hefty price tags that you're going to have to reject. Thus understood, the difficulty is theoretical. It's about how the theory leads to highly counterintuitive results across different areas and so on. And it's hard for me to see that it gives us enough plausibility points elsewhere to justify the bargain.
So it seems to me like this is what Matt Lutz calls the now what objection to moral error theory. That, okay, we've come to conclude.
No, I don't think that's right. I think it's a different objection.
Okay. Well, let me rattle off what I was going to say, and then tell me how to think through this. Where he says, once we've come to think that there are no moral facts, our moral claims are all false. Like, now what? What do we do? And insofar as I understand what he then says, it's that we can still continue to live our lives exactly the same, because we have these strong preferences, and it makes sense that we would just live in accord with them. So Matt says repeatedly, I have a strong distaste for murder. I really don't like that. And I don't like a world where that happens. And so I'm going to act in accord with that preference. And, there's nothing I can do to get rid of that preference. And so it makes sense to just act in accord with it. It would be like if you had a pathological aversion to vanilla ice cream. Well, if you did, then you would just avoid vanilla ice cream. And it wouldn't matter to you if you were told, well, there's no objective facts about what flavor of ice cream is best. You would still have your preference and act in accord with it. I think is the gist of his response. And so maybe what he would say here is, given all of that, it still makes sense to teach your children moral principles and to feel resentment when somebody harms you and so on and so forth, because these just are your kind of inbuilt preferences and see, in some sense of rational, which I know itself is a normative claim, seems rational to follow your preferences. So there you go. There's a family of related responses.
Yeah. So as I said, I think it's a somewhat different objection. The line of thought that I try to develop has nothing to do with the question, what will you do now? Maybe the way I put it invited that understanding, but it's not about how will we survive now that we've come to see the light and the truth of the moral error theory. I'm actually not a fan of that objection. I don't find what you said in reply to it very convincing, and I'll say something about it in a second. But in general, roughly because of your own distinction from earlier on between pragmatic and theoretical considerations, the mere fact that it's not clear how to proceed does not mean that the theory is necessarily false, or even that it's one that we should reject, I think. But my objection was different. My objection was just about what are the intuitive judgments that follow, and what are the judgments that follow, how intuitive or counterintuitive are they, and so how are we doing in terms of tallying plausibility points. If your theory entails that there are only three minds in the universe, that counts against your theory. It's not a conclusive argument against your theory, because I still have to see its advantages, and I have to see the advantages and disadvantages, the theoretical advantages and disadvantages of competing theories. But let's just put it this way: if you want to convince me that there are only three minds in the universe, there's a pretty serious burden of proof on you, burden of argument on you. You have to give very convincing arguments to that effect. Otherwise, I'm sticking to the thought that there are either many, many more, or perhaps somewhat less minds in the universe, but certainly not three. It's the same kind of logic, right? Say, well, if you have one theory or family of theories according to which it's wrong to humiliate people, that sentence ends up being true. And then there are other theories on which that sentence ends up being false. Other things being equal, go for the first. And similarly for many other things. Pain is bad, wishful thinking is not the best way of forming beliefs, etc., etc. The fact that error theorists have developed the kind of palate that allows them to enjoy biting bullets, while psychologically an interesting fact about that, should not make us lose our confidence. These are bullets that they're biting. And I'm all for, in some cases, biting bullets. That's fine. But being intellectually honest about it should be to say, look, it hurts. Here's what an honest error theorist, I think, should have said, okay? I have independent reason to be a metaphysical naturalist. The job description of moral facts does not allow me in good faith to be a moral naturalist. And so I'm drawn to an error theory. But if I could have had all of my favorite metaphysics and epistemology, and also found a way to accommodate the thought that it's wrong to humiliate people, that would have been better. I can't do that, and I have to choose, and the best bargain overall in terms of plausibility is my error theory. But sure, it would have been better to accommodate that as well. And similarly for other normative facts. It's actually quite striking when I'm thinking about this now, that they never say that, right? When David Lewis puts forward his not fully realist, although he differs, kind of subjectivist dispositional theory of value, he does say at some point, it would have been better had I been able to accommodate a stronger kind of objectivity, but so be it, right? And I say, this is my robust realism, it would have been better had I had a better meta-semantic theory to go along with it. Or similarly for other strong objections to realism. But, here's what I can do to make things less bad in those terms. And also my theory has tremendous advantages elsewhere. So overall, I submit it's the best overall theory. So that's what I think an honest error theorist would have to say. Of course I pay a price in having to deny these really strongly intuitive kind of claims. But look how wonderful my theory is in other terms. To which I respond with, first, don't underestimate the prices you're paying. Second, by all means, let's see how wonderful your theory is in other terms. And as it turns out, some of the arguments for error theory are highly unconvincing, like Mackey's, for instance. And some of the objections to moral realism can be coped with either by showing that they are confused, or by showing that they are actually not confused, they do have a point, but their harm is not that bad. Then everything will depend on the details.
Agree with you about counterintuitiveness being a real cost of a theory. And yet I can't help but feel that there's something dissatisfying with that as a response to the question, why should we be robust moral realists? Well, the denial of it is counterintuitive. Maybe because intuition is such a vaguely defined term that I'm not really sure. Like what would be the structure of the argument that has as its conclusion, therefore, robust moral realism is true, or there are robust moral facts? And what are the premises leading to that? That's kind of what I want to see is here are the premises, and then here's the conclusion that is supportive of robust moral realism. Does that kind of make sense? Like right. What I would want ideally?
Yeah, sure. But recall where we are in the dialectics. You didn't ask me what are your reasons to believe in robust moral realism. You asked me roughly what are your reasons to believe in robust moral realism rather than the error theory. These are very different questions. I have arguments that are, I hope, have some weight, at least vis-a-vis some other views, both in terms of a positive argument for my view and in terms of criticism of alternative views. But you asked me to compare robust realism and error theory. So in a sense, you've already given me a lot for free, what I call the job description, right? And in another sense, you've taken away a lot of my argumentative resources. You may, as you put it now, you made it at least somewhat unsatisfying to rely on first-order moral intuitions. With those restrictions in place, I'm now I am somewhat incapacitated, not fully, but yes. And there are also very, very intricate dialectical issues that come up. For instance, when I argue against error theories, relying, say, on first-order normative judgments, I'm often accused of begging the question against the error theorist. For obviously, the error theorist rejects these judgments. So I refuse to argue from neutral grounds, as it were. I don't play by the rules of the debate. But I would say that that's not... So begging the question is a tricky fallacy. It sometimes is a fallacy, but not always. And here again, I would use a quote from David Lewis, which I already paraphrased. David Lewis talks about, I think, about Graham Priest and his claims that there are true contradictions. And Lewis says, again, this is not the exact quote, well, I know that Priest is wrong. How do I know that? Because there are no true contradictions, nor can there be. And he says, wait a second, am I not in violation of the rules of debate? I'm supposed to argue from neutral grounds. Priest has called too much into question. I no longer have neutral grounds to stand on. But that doesn't mean that the argument's not good. So much for the thought that philosophy should always respect the rules of debate. So against the error theorist, I'm happy to do what I just did, just an example, to rely, say, on first-order judgments that the error theorist will reject. The mere fact that they will reject it, the mere fact that there's that I cannot argue from neutral grounds, that in itself does not show that the argument is not a good one.
I think that's a powerful dialectical maneuver, especially here, because I've talked to Graham Priest, and I feel the exact same way as David Lewis. I just think there's no way this can be right, and that's good enough for me. And he had very similar sentiments in response to me. But I think that a more satisfying maneuver is, at least in principle, available here, where you might argue like this. You might say, we can show that intuition, as a faculty, or however we want to cash that out, is prima facie justified. Like, that which is intuitive is in general, like, if it's intuitive that X, then it's prima facie justified to believe that X, or some such general principle. And then you could say, we have moral intuitions that X, where you fill in the blank with some moral judgment, like torturing innocent people for fun is wrong. That seems intuitively true when we cash out what it means for something to be intuitive. And therefore, it follows from that we have this strong, even prima facie warrant for thinking that that claim is true. And so if you give that argument, especially in a context where you've winnowed down the options to error theory or robust moral realism, well, then you have something, you have an argument for it, which isn't obviously non-neutral. It does seem neutral, at least in principle. And then Matt Lutz will give an objection to intuition and so on and so forth. But like, that's something I can latch onto, you know?
Yeah, whether it's neutral will arguably depend on what exactly the commitments are of the specific error theorist you were talking to at that time, right? So the way you put it, and it's a way that I accept, is, what Mike Humer calls, I guess, phenomenological conservatism or something along these lines, right? You don't have to talk about intuitions. You talk as he does, about the thought that when it seems to you that P, that gives at least some initial reason to believe that P. And some of these seemings are perceptual seemings. So when something looks red to you, that gives you at least some initial reason to think it's red, in the absence of outweighing evidence or undercutting evidence or whatever, or defeaters. But similarly, when it seems to you in a more intellectual seeming kind of way, when it seems to you that no claim of the form P and not P can be true, that's pretty strong reason to believe that that's so. Similarly, when it seems to you that it's wrong to humiliate people without serious justification, that gives you at least some initial reason to believe it's true. And maybe there can be defeating reasons, but we'd have to see them. So yes, I do accept this way of putting things. I don't know that it's much more by way of argument than what I said, because you don't have to be an epistemologist in order to be justified in relying on perception, right? Similarly, you don't have to be an epistemologist in order to be justified in relying on moral intuitions. You need to be an epistemologist in order to answer epistemological worries about relying on intuitions. But yeah, so but I do endorse this.
So then that the natural question is, are there good objections to moral or to robust moral realism? I think I agree that it's definitely the default position for all the reasons we've outlined. I mean, I think my personal level of conviction in this metaethical view is close to my conviction that there is an external world and that I'm not dreaming right now or trapped in the matrix. I mean, really, that might seem wholly radical to the moral error theorist or other kind of metaethical adherent, but I think those are on a par in terms of their warrant. Still, there are many, or at least several, objections that are pressed against moral realism, and so I wanted to get your thoughts on them. The first of these would be just the fact of moral disagreement within a culture and across cultures at any one moment of time and then across time. I mean, you don't have to think very hard to think about examples of moral disagreements, people coming to opposite conclusions about what is morally good or right or wrong or evil in the same circumstance. They'll come to opposite conclusions. And I think one example here that was interesting to me is the Yanomami tribe, an indigenous people group living in the Amazon. And so Napoleon Chagnon's ethnographic work, he has a book where he outlines the practices of this people group. And whether you think that this is an accurate characterization or not, I take it that there are going to be examples like this. And so, this is an indigenous group that where violence and warfare are celebrated, where revenge killing and feuding are seen as morally obligatory, where women are regarded as property, and so on and so forth. And so, wholly apart from the accuracy of his characterization, what accounts for these pronounced moral disagreements if robust moral realism is true? And I mean, we can think about examples within our own culture of disagreements in applied ethics about euthanasia, about same-sex marriage, about abortion, so on and so forth. You'd think that if there were objective, person-independent facts, and all we needed to do was just look and see what they are, we shouldn't be coming to such radical disagreements. So that's the first issue. What do you think about that?
The first thing I think about it is that it's not the first issue because it's a bunch of issues. So when I, in my work, when I address the argument from disagreement, one of my main points is that there are really many different kinds of arguments that go by that name, and in order to evaluate them, we need to distinguish between them. The line of thought that you put here, I think, is roughly the inference to the best explanation line of thought. Namely, you look at the world and you find some phenomenon, here in this case, moral disagreement both within and across cultures, communities, and so on. And then you ask, well, what best explains this? And you offer at least a couple of alternatives. One alternative is that there are these moral truths that are fully objective and so on, but we somehow miss them. The alternative explanation is that there just are no objective moral facts, but somehow perhaps the moral facts are a function of moral convention, or perhaps they're in some other ways depend on us and so vary across cultures, communities, individuals, whatever the case may be. And then the crucial claim is that the latter is the better explanation. And if you are into that kind of inference, if you think that inference is the best explanation is a good rule of inference, then this is your argument. I do accept inference is the best explanation. But I think that it's really unclear what the alternative explanations here are, and crucially, which one of them is best. So you said something like, look, it's really, you would have thought, I think that was the phrase you used, you would have thought that if there are these objective facts out there and we just have to look and see them, then we would have seen much more by way of agreement than we do now. But of course, nobody thinks that. I mean, that view suggests that it's not just that the objective facts are there, but that it's extremely easy to find out truth about them. But why would you think that? And more to the point, why would you settle the realist with this thought? So it's not a part of realism that it's very easy to know what the moral facts are. In fact, sometimes a part, and this is not just true of ethics, but of other domains as well, sometimes a part of the motivation for going realist is precisely kind of epistemic modesty. There can be facts about these things that we do not know. That certainly I don't know now, and that other people don't know. Because, if this is genuinely a part of reality, then it's not in principle more puzzling that there would be parts of this reality that we are not aware of or that we have false beliefs about than it is about other parts of reality, right? So I think there's much more that can be said in a much more plausible way about what the realist should say about this agreement. Here's another thing on this side and then something on the anti-realist, perhaps error theorist explanation. On the more realist side, there's also a kind of a false presupposition there, and that's that all cases of disagreement should receive the same explanation. And then you ask, well, what is a plausible, sweeping, one explanation fits all kind of story? And perhaps the realist is not very good at coming up with one. But the realist does not have to accept that presupposition, because it's quite possible that the phenomenon of moral disagreement is actually not unified at all. It's a bunch of phenomena. And it's best explained by a bunch of explanations. Some of them will have to do with stupidity. Some of them will have to do with interests. People are very poor, very bad at recognizing truth that it hurts them to recognize. Right? Some disagreements are going to be understood as really the application of the same underlying principles to radically different circumstances. And so on. There are going to be other explanations as well. There's no need for a unified explanation here. Because, it's not as if the phenomenon is intuitively, pre-theoretically unified. It's a really diverse phenomenon, so coming up with diverse explanations actually makes sense. In some cases, the right thing to say would be, why would you expect to see agreement? I mean, people come with different views. Some of them are idiots, some of them are geniuses, everything in between. Many of them are very smart about some things and unbelievably idiotic about others. Why would you expect agreement? Where are all these areas in which you see so much agreement, right? So again, I don't think this takes care of all of the phenomena. But I think that combined with other things, you get a plausible thing to say about disagreement that is entirely consistent with realism. But now on the opposite side, there's something in the sentiment of an objection from disagreement to moral realism. That's about, taking people seriously, not being too nonchalant about attributing why they are a mistake to them. Right? Don't say that they're stupid or motivated by interest in it, you are not. Right? Take the controversy more seriously. Okay, in some moods I can sort of sympathize with the sentiment. But then the result, the bottom line that you're supposed to be motivating with this kind of thought is a global error theory about morality. This is a theory that attributes highly wide-ranging mistakes, highly important mistakes about to pretty much everyone who's ever existed, about things everyone is also extremely confident in. So the thought that an argument from disagreement can score the error theorist points over the moral realists, that thought is even less plausible. Again, because of the way you frame things here, we're mostly comparing moral realism to error theory. There are other metaethical views, and the thought that maybe disagreement can do something to motivating one of these other views, that may be a little bit more plausible. But the thought that you are unwilling to attribute too many mistakes to too many people, so the moral realist is in trouble. Therefore, error theory, huge mistakes to everyone, that thought does not seem very, very convincing.
So what is going on in the case of the Yanomami tribe, for example? I mean, obviously, you don't need the specific ethnographic knowledge of that tribe to address what I'm getting at. Like, there are people groups who have, by and large, especially in the past, practiced a considerably different moral code of conduct than what we in Western society would largely affirm. Do you have, even if not one, at least, a manageable number of plausible explanations for how this difference of opinion arises? If it's not, well, this is all just, a reflection of people's preferences. There are objective facts here, except we come to different opinions about it because X, Y, and Z. So you gestured at like being a genius versus being stupid, but I don't think you'd want to say, Western democratic ideals and so on and so forth. That comes from being a genius, whereas everyone else in the past was an idiot. I think you'd probably think that intellectual levels varied at the same rate across time. So what would be a graspable number of explanations for this divergence of opinion?
What does it take to explain? What does it take to explain in ethics, but elsewhere as well, disagreement? So take just this kind of case. Schematically, we disagree about P. Well, it seems to me that if you have an explanation of why they believe P, an explanation of why we believe not P, you will have given an explanation of why we disagree about P. Fair enough? Okay, now how do you give an explanation of, say, their view of gender roles? And you'll give an explanation. The explanation may be partly biological, partly social evolution, partly about utilities, partly about who has power, partly about culture, partly about other things as well. Then you'll want to give an explanation of our view of gender roles. Who the hell knows what this is anymore, right? But maybe your and my view is one view. Maybe the view that's very common in the UK is another, and maybe the view that's very common in the world today is actually pretty close to that one, to the one we're trying to distance ourselves from, right? But, okay. But anyway, you'll give an explanation. The explanation will be how the common view used to be rather similar to whatever tribe we're talking about, but then there were these and those changes in, say, both theoretically, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Mill wrote some interesting texts, I don't know, but also much more plausibly there are going to be differences in who controls the means of production, in technologies, in the, development of birth control technologies, and whatever it is that you're going to give there. What in these explanations of either side is in any way, in any tension at all with robust realism? Not refutes robust realism. In any tension at all. What prevents me or even just burdens me a tiny little bit as a moral realist to give such explanations, whatever their precise scientific details are?
But wouldn't that be troublesome from the vantage point that if those are the explanatory mechanisms you're going to cite for why people in the past believed these things and then why they changed their minds, it seems like you've cited mechanisms which are not necessarily truth-oriented. They're sort of orthogonal to what is true. They would have been operative and happened whether or not the moral beliefs themselves were true or false. So then the worry is, well, if they were operative then, maybe they're operative now, and that explains why we believe what we do. And so you might not get to moral error theory.
What would follow from that?
Well, what I think it might not get you to moral error theory, and this might violate the dialectic as we've set it up. But you might get to moral skepticism.
I know, but what would it get?
You might get to more,
Exactly.
skepticism.
Skepticism seems to me a very respectable view. It's not, I don't think we're forced to it, but it's a respectable view. And it's very different from error theory. In fact, it's the error theorists who seem to think that skepticism is not an option. Right? Here's a way of looking at it. They are so concerned about skepticism. They're so concerned about the epistemology that they're willing to screw up their metaphysics just to avoid that. Right? I insist on my metaphysics. I know what I want, namely these perfectly objective moral parts of the universe. And then I say, okay, let's do our best epistemology and see. For anything thus far said, skepticism is still an option. I accept, based on the methodology we've already discussed, that, if my view leads to skepticism and some other view doesn't, that in itself is a reason to prefer the other view. It's a loss of a considerable amount of plausibility points to entail moral or normative skepticism. But then, the next thing to do is to do epistemology, by all means. It's a legitimate challenge for someone like me to say, well, can you give us a plausible story? Can you tell us a plausible story of how we come to know these truths, or anyway, some of them, or anyway, to have justified beliefs about them, or something along these lines? And then we need to talk about that as well. I am perfectly willing to accept in some cases that some disagreements may lead to at least local skeptical islands, as it were. Namely, disagreements where you don't find any plausible differentiating explanation in terms of how, say, there are some social, historical, economic factors that tend to blind them to the truth, but not us, right? If you can tell such a story, then skepticism doesn't fall. If you can't, sure, it's quite about some things. I'm willing to endorse it. I just don't think that it leads to anything remotely resembling a global moral skepticism.
What do you make of evolutionary debunking arguments for our moral beliefs? That, in many cases anyway, the argument goes, we can come up with a plausible evolutionary explanation as to why we believe this thing about morality, why we believe a certain course of action is good or bad or right and wrong. And the evolutionary process, by the nature of the case, is not aimed at truth, but at survivability. It doesn't really matter whether the moral beliefs in question are true or false, so long as they get you to do the thing that results in your survival. And it seems like that's exactly what happens. And so one instance is our moral preference that we place among or on our own kin as opposed to just random strangers. We think we often have heightened moral obligations to our brothers and sisters and parents, and even sometimes our extended family of aunts and uncles and grandparents, that we do not have to the random Joe on the street. And the evolutionary explanation for that, I guess, would be that the individuals in our family share our genetic code. They share our genes. And so a preference for them, at least in some sense, helps us survive insofar as it helps us pass along our shared genetic material. But you could even just see it as when you have a strong preference for a very small clan versus everybody else, you're probably going to survive better than somebody who thinks everybody is morally equal and that everybody needs to be protected by my own resources to the same degree. Like, you're probably going to die soon. And I don't have a proof of that. That just seems plausible. So I guess there's two questions here. The first is, do we have evolutionary explanations for the majority of our moral beliefs? And secondly, if we did, would that lend itself towards moral skepticism?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot to be said here. And to say that I'm not an expert on the relevant parts of evolutionary science will be an understatement. I don't think it's an adequacy constraint that we have evolutionary explanations of our moral beliefs. I think the adequacy constraint is that we have plausible explanations of our moral beliefs that are consistent with evolution theory. So it's not clear that everything's going to come out of evolution theory, but whatever we end up telling should not violate it in any way, right? That's already a significant difference there. Some people who know a little bit more about evolution than I do actually question these little stories. So there's a nice story by my colleague at Hebrew, Arnon Levy, or Levi, I guess, and his and a colleague from Tel Aviv, Yair Levi, where they show how this evolutionary hand waving does not seem to work with the science. For one thing, if we're talking natural selection rather than social selection, there hasn't been remotely enough evolutionary time for such an explanation to work. So it's complicated. The details are complicated. But I'm going to put that to one side for our purposes. here's what I am willing to concede. There is a naturalistic explanation of the fact that we have the moral beliefs that in fact we do. It's probably going to be partly in evolutionary terms, probably not only in evolutionary terms. I don't care. There's nothing magical there. And I also think, and that's the crucial part, I think that the essence of this challenge can be put without even any reference to evolution. The main problem for someone like me is that moral properties, moral facts, on my view, are causally inert. So they cannot play a role in causal explanations of anything. And in particular, nor can they play a role in the causal explanation of our relevant beliefs. That's the problem. The problem is that with other beliefs, say with your belief that there's with my belief that there's a laptop in front of me, the laptop itself can play a causal role in the generation or maintenance of that belief. But that's not true of moral beliefs because they are about things that are causally inert. So we need here an epistemological story that will suffice to sustain justified belief, and so to reject skepticism, in the face of the absence of causal effects of the relevant subject of beliefs. I think we can do that. I tried to do that in my book, in a relevant paper as well. But let me just give you this sort of sloganish kind of answer. So people who put forward evolutionary debunking arguments are right that we can't give an explanation of our moral beliefs in ways that renders the moral facts as it were responsible for them, because that's the kind of stuff that the fact that moral facts are causally inert preempts. Nor can the moral realist give an explanation that proceeds in the opposite direction, as if it's our beliefs that somehow explain or are responsible for the moral truths, the moral facts, the moral properties, because that would go against the kind of mind independence that realists posit. But that doesn't mean that we're committed to a kind of unbridgeable gap between the normative facts and our normative beliefs, the kind of gap that would give rise to skepticism. Instead, we can go for what is now called in the literature a third factor explanation, namely that there is something else that explains both. I like to think about it as a pre-established harmony kind of explanation, except without God. And I think this is something we can do in our case as well. There are different suggestions in the literature. I have my little favorite third factor explanation. There are other kinds as well. They differ in details, and so also differ in plausibility, may depend on other things, right? I'll just give you the sketch. The sketch of mine goes something like, look, presumably something evolutionary played a role in shaping our moral beliefs. But that something evolutionary is not valueless. It is natural, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It's not an evaluative or a normative fact, but it may have value. In particular, the evolutionary aim, and the quotes are important because it's not a real aim, right? We're not going for a teleological understanding of evolution, but whatever it is that evolution tends towards, what's that? We use the word survival, many people do. That's probably strongly imprecise, right? It's more like reproductive success, or the reproductive success of the gene rather than of the organism, or something along these lines. Well, as long as this has positive value, you get your initial correlation between the powers that regulate our moral beliefs, that explain them, and the things that are of value. You don't get a direct relation between our moral beliefs and the moral truths, but you do get something that synchronizes them in a pre-established harmony kind of way. Anyway, that's my story, and as I said, there are different versions of it out there.
I think the general worry with third factor responses is that there's a fear that it's circular. Maybe you'd agree it's circular in a sense, but that like if the evolutionary process had gone differently, if you changed the initial conditions, then you may well get highly evolved intelligent organisms with wildly different moral beliefs that are contradictory to our own, and they could probably claim the same kind of third factor response. Is there an issue here?
I don't think so. First, even if they could, what would follow is that they are as justified in their beliefs as we are in ours. But they would also be privy to radically different bodies of evidence. It's not surprising to think that creatures who are exposed to radically different bodies of evidence have different justified beliefs. And certainly nothing follows about the truth as it were being different. No, it's one truth. And what you believe about, even if you are highly epistemically competent, will depend on the kind of evidence to which you are exposed. So I don't see that as a huge problem. As to the general issue of the counterfactual robustness of the story that I told, right? We can imagine situations in which it would have been evolutionarily beneficial to have very different moral beliefs and so on. Well, but that's true of all of our beliefs as well, right? So you can imagine a situation in which it would have been beneficial to have perception that's very different than the one we have now. Does global skepticism follow? As far as I can see, first of all, the answer is no. Although maybe it's not obvious why the answer is no, but the answer is no. Global skepticism does not follow from this thought about these counterfactuals. And second, as far as I can see, the case of moral knowledge is not importantly different here from the case of knowledge in general.
So I want to pivot to a broader set of issues that I put before Michael Huemer, and he seemed to think there was really nothing here worth discussing. But I come at this from a background within philosophy of religion, where a significant part of that conversation involves looking at the foundations of morality, specifically of an objective morality. And when you talk to people like Jerry Walls, David Baggett, Paul Copan, William Lane Craig, there's great emphasis placed upon the need to provide an explanation for objective morality, objective moral facts, properties, and so on. And the idea is that if you pursue that line of reasoning enough, you will arrive at some sort of theistic explanation for morality, that we ultimately ground morality in God. So that's another way they phrase it, is like, what grounds morality in our worldview? And I'm not asking you to defend that particular answer, but do you think that we need to provide an answer to that question of like, what explains the existence of objective, evaluative facts, properties, values, and so on? Do you think we need one? Do you think there's an answer to that question? Again, when I asked Michael Huemer this, he was like, you can't, like, he's like, explain descriptive facts to me. And so I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm largely in agreement with Mike on this. There is a little bit more that can be said here. This kind of argument for theism, sometimes called the moral argument, it has further premises. So it's not just about how we need the ground, but it's also about how God can do the work. And I actually think both parts are wrong. So with Mike, I think we don't need the ground. But also I think that even if we do need something here, I don't see how God would have helped. There's actually a volume that's about to come out in the next few months, I think, on theism and atheism. So sort of like 5 arguments for theism, each discussed from a theist and an atheist, or at least a non-theist perspective. And I'm the non-theist on this on the moral argument, so this is discussed there a little bit. But I do want to be a bit more concessive than it seems that Mike was. Questions of grounding raise the following kind of general methodological worry. On the one hand, it's always possible that you've reached the bottom and then nothing grounds, right? Just like, justifications and explanations come to an end somewhere, so do grounding chains. And recognizing this seems to be just a part of philosophically growing up. Okay? On the other hand, it's not as if God whispers in our ear where grounding chains come to an end. So it seems like it's always, or almost always, worth our while to at least wonder whether there's a further grounding element to that chain. And sometimes the best way we can know that we've reached where the grounding chain comes to an end is that we can't find anything further. So I'm not sure I want to say that the question what grounds morality is, say, incoherent or incorporates a false presupposition or is just entirely unintelligible. But I want to insist on the answer nothing does, and that's perfectly okay, being a legitimate answer. The extent to which you should feel the temptation to find another grounding level partly depends on what would be a plausible answer. Forget what is a good answer. What would be a plausible answer? Which takes me back to my first point. So if many people use this and say, well, laws need a lawgiver, and so morality needs a God, then I would like to see the details of how that would go. And if I'm right that to the extent that there's a problem here, God cannot solve it, then this should make you a little bit more confident that there wasn't a problem here to begin with.
So the 2020 Chalmers-Bourget survey, to my surprise, indicated that most philosophers are moral realists. And while initially I thought, oh, wow, okay, we've affirmed this position, which I have always wanted to be true, it's all here, I took that to mean robust moral realism. But I don't think that follows automatically. And so I wanted to ask you, in your canvassing of the literature today, first of all, is it true that most philosophers are moral realists? And then secondly, are most of those robust moral realists? Is there any way to know, or is robust moral realism probably a minority position?
Well, most good philosophers are.
Right.
It's really tricky. I mean, even that survey, there were some methodological criticisms about, selection effect. So I would assume, for instance, that if you asked philosophers in Europe who tend less to write and read philosophy in English, you may get a different distribution of views than if you ask among the primarily Anglo-American philosophers, which I think was the main set surveyed in that specific study. I think, I'm not entirely sure. Then there are also other questions. You may want to ask what's the majority opinion within metaethicists compared to what's the majority opinion within philosophers. And if you ask the latter question, then you get all those philosophers of language who suddenly get a vote.
I agree, yeah.
The whole thing is weird, and it's not clear what exactly to make of it. But one of the most interesting thing about it, I actually think that survey was of value, but that it should be read. It's like Google Scholar data about philosophers. If you just read it as a number and that's it, it's more misleading than valid. But if you read it in an intelligent way, it can give you some good information. So that's what I think about that survey as well. One of the more interesting things about it was the kind of correlations that they found and so on, right? So yes, I think you're right that many of those who say they're moral realists are not robust realists. Perhaps many of them will just stick with either 2 or 3 initial commitments of realism that we started this conversation with. So something like, look, I don't know exactly what you metaethicists have in mind when you talk in your fancy ways about moral realism, but here's something I do know. It's wrong to humiliate people. Find a way of accommodating this, I'll sign on to it. I certainly won't sign on to something that says, no, that's false, but then there's something else to say. Maybe that's the case. If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure of this, there was a question about non-naturalist realism.
Okay.
Which showed that the numbers are fairly low, but much, much higher than they were a decade earlier, than they had been a decade earlier, which I thought of, clear evidence that my book has convinced me.
Right.
Or more realistically, there's a bit of a trend of this thing becoming more popular. I mean, here's an example that I like to bring. Alan Gibbard, in his first main metaphysical book, Wise Choices Apt Feelings, when he describes the view that I think he calls Platonism, close to this guy, he just debunks it. He says it's just, that's not an interesting view, let's go on. And I think it was okay. I mean, it wasn't okay substantively, but sociologically it was understandable given the field as the background against which he was writing that book. But today that would have been harder to get away with, I think. At least, in the kind of circles that we're talking about.
All right. Well, David, Enoch, thank you for coming on the podcast. Fascinating conversation.
Oh,
It's
thank you, Mike.
of course,
It was a
it's
pleasure.
always a pleasure to bring on people that I agree with, especially when it comes to moral realism. That tends to get people in the comments section anyway riled up. So,
Really animate. I see.
right.
Okay,
So
good.
anyway, yeah, thank you for coming on, and I hope to speak to you again.
I'll expect a hate mail. Thanks so much for having me.